Hi guys, tonight we're starting somewhere that most royal historians politely tiptoe around: the royal bedchamber. Not the ceremonial ribbon and velvet, picture-perfect bedchamber you see in a museum brochure. No, you're stepping into the real thing, as it existed when one particular medieval king decided that this was not just a place for sleeping, but the epicenter of his personality. You push open a heavy carved door. It's warm to the touch, polished so often it feels almost oily. Inside, the air is thick with a sweet, almost cloying scent. It's not the gentle lavender sachet you might expect. It's musk, amber, and something faintly metallic, like coins that have been in someone's pocket too long. The bed is massive, easily big enough to fit 6 people, which, awkwardly, it often did. Not in the way fairy tales imagine a prince's slumber party. This was a working space for a king whose idea of diplomacy sometimes involved inviting foreign envoys into situations that made them either unusually loyal or unusually quick to request transfer. The headboard is carved with elaborate hunting scenes, but if you look closer, some of those stags and hounds are, let's just say, engaged in activities they do not teach in art history class. Historians still argue whether those carvings were symbolic metaphors of fertility and abundance, or just proof the court's woodcarver had a wicked sense of humor. You notice the sheets. They're real silk, imported at outrageous expense from the East, dyed deep crimson. Silk in the 14th century was so valuable that owning it could be considered a public statement of dominance. But here, the silk isn't for ceremony. It's crumpled, tangled, showing faint shadows of spilled wine, and maybe a dab of honey. The honey part is not random. This king was known to have an experimental approach to sweeteners. According to one account, possibly exaggerated, possibly not, he once demanded that the royal cook prepare an entire roast peacock, glazed with honey, and then serve it in the bedchamber, on the sheets, so he could eat where he rests. The bedposts are topped with gold leaf finials, but there's a subtle groove worn into the wood, like rope has been tied there many times. Was it for hanging drapes, or for more private purposes? Official court records do not say, which of course means your imagination is free to wander. In the corner, a small brazier glows faintly, heating not just the room, but a tall bronze kettle suspended above it. The smell coming from that kettle is spiced wine, cinnamon, cloves, and a faint hint of rosewater. This king believed that drinking warm, scented wine before bed would ensure vivid dreams. Whether those dreams were political strategies or something considerably less parliamentary is open for speculation. You try to take a seat on the edge of the mattress and immediately sink several inches. Medieval beds for the elite weren't stuffed with feathers like yours. They were layered with down, wool, and sometimes even exotic materials like swan's neck feathers. Luxurious, yes, but this one is almost too soft, as if designed for lounging rather than sleeping. There's also an odd indentation in the center, not from wear, but from being pressed down frequently. On the wall above the bed hangs a tapestry, not of battles or saints, but of a moonlit orchard, with figures in various poses that make you glance twice, then a third time. The dye is rich indigo and deep green, shimmering slightly in the lamplight. It's said that this tapestry was commissioned from a Flemish workshop that usually made church altarpieces, and that they were scandalized by the request. But gold coins have a way of softening moral objections. The imagery is both playful and suggestive, and like much medieval art, the longer you stare, the more you see by the window. If you can call a slit in the stone a window, stands a wooden chest. It's slightly ajar, revealing a pile of garments, not the usual royal robes of state, but costumes. Masks shaped like animals, embroidered cloaks, even a delicate silver circlet, clearly sized for someone else's head. Was this for court masks? Possibly. Was it for private theatrics? Almost certainly. You're not sure which is stranger. that a king would spend so much on such things, or that he kept them right next to his sleeping quarters instead of in a wardrobe room. And then, there's the bedchamber audience. You thought this would be a private space, but medieval royalty often had attendants sleep nearby, in the same room, or even on small pallets at the foot of the bed. Privacy was a luxury few rulers allowed themselves. Being king meant being constantly observed, but this king, he turned observation into performance. There are records of him inviting his inner circle to witness the joy of the royal spirit, which could mean anything from poetry readings to elaborate games of chance played while reclining among cushions. The chronicler who wrote that line was notably vague, which is either discretion or deliberate bait for future gossip. From a purely historical perspective, bedchambers like this served as a political theater. Negotiations happened here. Gifts were exchanged here. Alliances were sealed here. In more ways than one, the opulence was as much a message as any formal proclamation. I have wealth, I have power, and I am not afraid to live in a way that shocks you. That shock had a purpose. It made courtiers dependent on his approval, drawn into his eccentric orbit. You reach out and trail your fingers along the silk coverlet. It's cool under your skin, but carries the faint scent of rosewater, and oddly, salt. Maybe from sweat, maybe from some ritual involving sea brine that's been lost to time. In a corner alcove, a caged songbird stirs, feathers ruffling. Its presence is no accident. This king kept nightingales indoors, believing their song could inspire tender thoughts in the listener. Whether that belief was poetic or is another debate for historians and gossips alike. The candlelight flickers, throwing shadows across the carved headboard. The figures in the wood seem to move for a moment, but it's just the unsteady flame, or maybe not. You shift on the mattress, and the soft creak of the bed frame feels almost like a sigh. In the dim warmth, surrounded by silk and gold, and the faint scent of spice and musk, you realize this space isn't just a room. It's an extension of the man who ruled from it, a place where politics, pleasure, and perception blended into something you can't quite name. And just as you think you've seen it all, you notice a small, unassuming door and you leave the bedchamber behind, or at least try to. But your nose pulls you toward the next scene before your feet even know where they're going. The scent is unmistakable. Roasted meat, spiced wine, and something faintly sweet, like candied fruit left too long in the sun. You follow it down a stone hallway, the kind with torches that sputter in a way that makes you wonder if they're actually safe, and step into the great hall. It is not mealtime in the usual sense. It is always mealtime here. The long oak table is already set with pewter plates and silver goblets, though many of them aren't quite clean, a sign that the last feast blurred seamlessly into the next. The king, you're told, believed that food was a divine blessing that should never be imprisoned by schedules. If you wanted goose at midnight or cherries in February, he'd make it happen. The fact that cherries in February meant importing them at ruinous expense from the Mediterranean, a minor inconvenience. The hall smells heavy, not bad, exactly, but intense, like a spice market collapsed into a butcher's shop. A boar's head sits at one end of the table, its mouth stuffed with a lemon and its eyes replaced with polished glass beads. It's decorative, but also unnervingly lifelike, as if it might lunge forward if you lean in too close. Next to it is a pie, not just any pie, one with live birds inside. Yes, that's not a myth. Historical records show that medieval banquets sometimes featured pies that, when cut open, released live animals as a sort of entertainment. Whether they were then cooked afterward is a detail historians prefer not to dwell on. You glance toward the king's chair. It's taller than the others, not just in height but in personality. Its backrest is carved with grapevines and smiling satyrs, the kind of imagery that leaves little to the imagination about the hall's preferred mood. Draped across it is a fur cloak, possibly wolf, possibly something rarer. The king isn't here right now, but his presence lingers in the form of half-drunk goblets, discarded napkins, and the faint echo of laughter that still seems to vibrate in the rafters. The servants, and there are dozens, move like actors in a slow, continuous play. Some are carrying platters of roasted venison. Others are topping up goblets with mead so thick it clings to the cup's edge before reluctantly sliding down. There's music, too. Not the lively jig-around table kind, but slow lute strumming, meant to blend with the clink of cutlery and the murmur of voices. One historical account, written by a visiting Italian diplomat, describes a night here when the feast lasted so long the candles burned out twice, and the king simply had the chandeliers refilled with fresh tallow, declaring, "The night ends when we tire, not when the sun says so." Historians still argue whether this was a sign of decadent confidence or of a ruler completely disconnected from reality, possibly both. Your eyes land on something at the far end of the table, a stack of small golden dishes, each holding what looks like a quail egg dusted with powdered sugar. You're informed these are candied almonds sculpted to look like eggs. Why? Because the king enjoys the confusion, a servant whispers. That sums up the entire scene, a deliberate mix of opulence and mischief. At one point, a servant hurries past you, carrying an enormous silver tureen. You glance inside. It's stew, yes, but with slices of lemon, and is that cinnamon bark floating in it? This king's kitchen didn't just borrow flavors from distant lands. It swallowed entire cuisines whole and mashed them into something only he could love. Whether his guests loved it was irrelevant. This was his hall, his feast, his rules. You notice that there's no single main course. Dishes arrive in no particular order, sometimes repeating, sometimes vanishing after just a few bites have been served. It's chaos disguised as generosity, and in the center of the silk, gold, and strange company you step away from the feast, but the echo of it clings to you. The low hum of voices, the faint sugar on your fingertips, the slow, heavy satisfaction of being somewhere you probably shouldn't be, but can't quite leave. The air shifts as you move down a side corridor. It cools, sharpens, and smells faintly of beeswax and something floral you can't name. The sound of the hall fades, replaced by something softer, fabric whispering against fabric. A faint jingling like coins in a pouch. And was that laughter? The corridor ends at an arched doorway framed in gold leaf. The gold isn't the brassy, too bright kind you see in modern reproductions. It's warm, muted, as if it has absorbed centuries of candlelight and is reluctant to give it back. A curtain of deep blue velvet hangs in place of a door, heavy enough that when you touch it, your hand sinks in like it's testing the softness of fresh bread. You push it aside, and the first thing that hits you is color. Not just one, all of them. This is not a throne room, not exactly. It's a private salon, an in-between space where the king receives only those he wants close, and the rules of court behave differently here. The walls are hung with tapestries, each more detailed than the last. One shows a garden with fountains spilling over with wine instead of water. Another depicts a procession of animals dressed in human clothes. A fox wearing a bishop's hat, a hare in a knight's armor. Historians still argue whether these were meant as political satire or just the king's idea of a good joke. Either way, the artistry is flawless. You can almost see the tiny knots in the weaving, the sheen of the dyed threads. The floor is covered in rugs, not just one layered over stone, but many, woven in Persia, in Anatolia, in places most of the king's guests have only heard of through stories. They're so thick you barely hear your own footsteps. The pattern under your feet right now is a deep crimson with a gold lattice, and you feel a small, irrational guilt about stepping on something that clearly took years to make. And then, there's the silk. It's everywhere, draped over low couches, tied in loose knots around the backs of chairs, hanging in strips from the ceiling so that the light filters through them in a dozen different shades. Some of it is sheer enough that you can see the flicker of candlelight through it. Some is heavy enough to muffle the sound of a voice. This silk, unlike the bedchamber's crimson sheets, isn't about comfort. It's about effect, making you feel cocooned, and maybe a little disoriented. The gold, though the gold is here to remind you where you are. It glints from the edges of mirrors, from the base of goblets, from small statues on side tables. One statue catches your eye. It's of a satyr holding a wine jug, but the jug is hollow, with a tiny opening at the top. This isn't decor, it's a discreet serving vessel. You can almost imagine the scene. A guest is handed the statue as if it's a gift, only to have the king himself tip it and pour wine into their cup. Playful, but calculated. The company in the room is just as calculated. There are no random courtiers lounging here. These are the king's favorites, poets with quick tongues, merchants with deep pockets, foreign visitors who might carry tales of his magnificence back to their own courts. They're dressed for spectacle. One man wears a robe embroidered entirely with tiny gold leaves, so fine they shift when he moves, catching the candlelight in ripples. A woman in the corner is playing a small harp, her sleeves trailing on the carpet like waves. Another woman, seated close to the king's vacant chair, wears a mask shaped like a bird's face, delicate, white, with a small golden beak. Masks are a theme here. Some guests wear them, some don't. The effect is that you're never entirely sure who you're talking to. Maybe that's the point. In a room where silk and gold blur the edges of reality, anonymity becomes another form of currency. The king, according to one chronicler, encouraged masked evenings so that truth could step forward, unburdened by identity. Whether that meant political candor or something more scandalous is predictably still debated. Low tables hold trays of food, but not the grand platters of the feast hall. These are small, precise, figs stuffed with almonds, slices of candied orange, little pyramids of soft cheese, dusted with herbs. Each bite is designed to be taken in one hand, while the other holds a goblet. The goblets themselves are curious, some glass, some silver, some pottery glazed in deep blue. You notice that none of them match. Either this is a deliberate statement against formality, or the king genuinely enjoys the look of a mismatched table. A faint scent threads through the room, not the meat-heavy air of the feast, but something lighter, rose, sandalwood, and maybe a hint of myrrh. It clings to the fabric, to the rugs, even to the hair of the people who pass close to you. At one point, a man with a long beard and an embroidered cap leans over to take a fig from the table, and you catch a stronger whiff of it. You realize it's not incense burning somewhere, it's oil rubbed directly into the skin. This was no accident. The scent was part of the room's script. In one corner, a low couch holds 3 people in close conversation. They're speaking in a language you don't recognize, and every so often they pause to laugh at a joke you'll never understand. They're not ignoring you exactly, but they're not acknowledging you either. You get the sense that in this room, conversations overlap like the silk drapes. The silk drape stirs again. This time, it's deliberate. A hand emerges first, long fingers, a gold ring on every one parting the fabric with a slow, measured grace. Then the king steps through, and the room doesn't so much react as shift. No gasps, no applause, just a quiet rearranging of posture, the way flowers turn toward the sun without making a sound. He's not dressed in the heavy crown-enderman combination you might expect from a monarch in an official setting. No, this is his private hour. He wears a loose robe of deep green silk, so dark it looks black until the candlelight catches it. Gold thread runs along the seams, catching the light like embers along the edges of coal. On his head, a circlet, not a crown, rests casually, almost mockingly. His bare feet are silent on the rugs, but the tiny bells sewn into his robe's hem give him away with the faintest chime at each step. The king moves toward his chair, but not directly. He detours, pausing to touch a guest's shoulder. to murmur something into another's ear, to lift a goblet from the table and take a sip without asking. Every movement is calculated to remind the room that this is his air they're breathing, his game they're playing. When he finally reaches his chair, he doesn't sit. Instead, he stands behind it, resting his hands on the carved arms, scanning the room with a gaze that is warm, curious, and utterly merciless. It's the kind of look that makes you straighten your back, even though he hasn't looked directly at you. "Shall we play?" he says at last, his voice low but carrying, the kind of voice that could tell you to burn down a city and make you think it was your own idea. There's a subtle ripple of movement as a servant approaches with a wooden chest. It's about the size of a bread loaf, bound in iron at the corners, with a heavy lock that clicks open under the king's hand. From inside, he withdraws a small handful of objects and lets them fall onto the nearest table. They scatter with a mix of soft thuds and metallic clinks, carved bone dice, painted tiles, a deck of playing cards whose edges are gilded. You've heard of these night games before, whispered references in the corridors, confessions from guests who've played and lost, or played and won, and somehow looked different afterward. They're not just games of chance. They're social hunts, wagers, where the stakes are rarely coins, and often favors, promises, or the slow accrual of a debt you can't name until it's called in. The king sits now, slowly, and gestures for the masked woman with the golden beak to come forward. She does, perching on the arm of his chair like a bird resting on a branch. He hands her the cards without a word, and she begins to deal. You're not invited to the table, not yet. Instead, you're given the privilege of watching, and watching is its own kind of participation here. The players are an odd mix: the merchant in the gold leaf robe, the harpist, who now sits silent with her instrument resting against her knee, the long-bearded man still smelling faintly of rose oil. They glance at one another between hands, weighing each other as much as the cards they hold. The first game is simple. Highest sum of dice wins. The prize is not announced. The merchant rolls, the bearded man rolls, the harpist rolls. The merchant wins a 6 and a 5, and the king leans back, smiling. Without a word, the masked woman produces a ring from her sleeve and places it in the merchant's palm. You wonder if it's gold, or if the real prize is something else entirely. Then the games shift. Now the painted tiles come into play, each one etched with a symbol, a crown, a serpent, a ship, a moon. They're drawn from a pouch, and each symbol carries a meaning the players seem to know without explanation. The bearded man draws a serpent, and the room chuckles softly, as if a private joke has just landed. The harpist draws the moon, and the king's eyes linger on her for a moment longer than polite. A historical account from a Venetian envoy describes a similar evening in this very room, noting that the games were less about winning and more about drawing the king's attention. Whoever caught his eye might find themselves invited to a private supper later, or entrusted with a mission. The obsession with perfume, you smell it before you hear the king's footsteps. It slips into the air, the way dawn slides into a room with thin curtains, not all at once, but in soft layers, building until you're aware that you are surrounded. It isn't one scent. That would be far too simple for him. No, this is a braid of smells, each one distinct, yet tangled in the others. Crushed jasmine petals still sticky from the morning dew. Sandalwood shaved so fine you could mistake it for silk. A bitter edge of saffron that sits just at the edge of sweetness. Something darker, like the smoke from a cedar fire. The perfume doesn't cling to him. That would imply it belongs to the king. Instead, the perfume moves ahead of him, as though it has its own will, announcing him before he arrives, carrying him into the space before his shadow can. By the time the green curtain parts, you are already inside the world he's chosen for you. Tonight the chamber is heavier with it than usual. Candles flicker in tall glass cylinders, their flames bending in the slow currents of perfumed air. Each breath you take feels curated, like someone is deciding what memory you should have when you wake tomorrow? He enters with no crown, no jewels, only the robe, thin silk, ivory white, open at the throat, and the smallest trace of sweat along his collarbone, where the scent gathers strongest. The perfume is so thick here that the air seems to shimmer, and you wonder, for the first time, if breathing too deeply might make you lightheaded. There are stories about his obsession. Servants tell of cedar chests brought from Damascus, each filled not with jewels or gold, but with tiny vials wrapped in embroidered cloth. Travelers recall passing through markets where every apothecary swore they supplied the king himself, each claiming a secret formula no other hand could make. One historical record, a dry, reluctant note in a Venetian envoy's diary, describes a reception where the king's chambers were so saturated with rose oil that the scent lingered on the envoy's clothing for 3 days, even after airing them in the open sun. The envoy called it an invisible leash. But there's a stranger rumor, one the palace guards speak of in low voices. The perfume isn't just for pleasure, it's camouflage. Not for him, but for the rooms themselves. You've noticed it yourself. The longer you sit here, the more the scents seem to shift, not just in tone, but in shape. First you smell the jasmine, then it fades, and the saffron rises. Then that too is buried under the velvet burn of musk. The air never smells the same for more than a few minutes, and it's never, ever neutral. Historians still argue over this. Was it simply indulgence? Or was it intentional? A way to confuse the senses, to make anyone who entered unsure of time, place, and memory. Tonight, he seems to test you. He moves closer, circling behind your chair, the faint brush of silk marking his path. You hear him inhale, slow, deliberate, as if you were the thing being scented. You notice it. He says, voice so close you can feel the breath on your ear. Most don't. Before you can answer, he moves away again, toward a low table by the wall. On it sits a lacquered box with hinges so finely worked they look like threads. He opens it, and the smell changes again, sharper now, citrus cutting through the heavier notes. Inside are small glass bottles, some no bigger than a thumb, others the size of a fist. The stoppers are carved from bone, wood, ivory. One by one, he uncorks them, and with each, the air shifts. Clove, myrrh, something green and wet, crushed mint leaves, chased immediately by the powdery ghost of violets. The scents layer and dissolve, like music notes played too quickly to separate. You realize, watching him, that the ritual is deliberate. He's not just choosing what he will smell like. He's choosing what you will remember. Every gesture, every tilt of the bottle is part of the performance. He dabs a drop on his wrists, behind his ears, along the collar of his robe. But then he does something stranger. He steps to the far wall, reaches up, and presses a drop of oil into the corner of the ceiling. Then another in the opposite corner. Then 2 more, higher than he could reach without stretching. No one laughs. No one asks why. The servants watch without blinking, as if this is normal. You understand, suddenly, that the perfume is for the room, not the man. A nearly unbelievable story, recorded by a French traveler and dismissed by most scholars. Claims that on certain nights, the king would fill copper basins with perfumed water and place them beneath open windows. The wind, passing over them, would carry the scent into the city streets, marking the air itself as royal property. Whether or not it's true, you can almost believe it, standing here now. When he is finished, the room feels altered, not just scented, but charged. You notice how guests shift in their seats, their eyes bright, their postures looser. Someone laughs more freely than before. A man you've never seen speaks to the harpist with an ease that wasn't there a moment ago. The air seems to have loosened their tongues as surely as wine might. And maybe that's the point. Not pleasure, not beauty, influence. You think of the envoy's invisible leash and wonder. Is the perfume meant to make you remember him, or to make you forget yourself? He returns to you last, pausing again at your shoulder. This time, he leans in closer, close enough that the heat from his skin seems to touch your neck. You smell the saffron again, but under it, something new, sharp, metallic. You can't name it. And that unsettles you more than any exotic flower or spice could. When he moves away, you find you've been holding your breath. You let it out, slowly, but the scent stays, clinging not to your clothes, not to your hair, but somewhere deeper, as though it's already part of you. Later, when the king has gone, and the candles burn lower, you notice something odd. The scent has changed again. Now it smells faintly of the sea salt, kelp, and that metallic temps of wet iron. But you are inside, hours from any shore, and just when you begin to wonder whether it's your imagination, you catch the eye of the masked woman with the golden beak. She tilts her head, as if listening to something you can't hear, and then, almost imperceptibly, she nods. You leave the chamber with the perfume still in your lungs, and for the rest of the night, you dream of nothing but color and heat and water that smells like saffron. Jewels in the wrong place. You've seen crowns before. Rings, brooches, the ordinary geography of wealth. But the king's relationship with jewels is less geography, more cartography drawn by a madman. He wears them where no one else would dare, and perhaps no one else could. The first time you notice it, you think it's a trick of the candlelight. There, just beneath his ear, where the skin is soft and unmarked, a tiny sapphire is embedded in gold, like a raindrop frozen in place. It catches the light only when he turns his head sharply, sending a blue spark across the room. Not an earring, there is no hook, no clasp, just the stone, sitting in his skin as if it grew there. He moves, and you see more. A narrow chain of garnets, stitched, literally stitched, into the lining of his robe, so that they flash red only when the silk folds in a certain way. A ring not on his finger, but on his thumb joint, where the skin creases at court dinners. You notice guests trying not to stare at his hands, not the way they gesture, but what's on them. A thin strip of beaten gold running along the side of his palm like a vein. A diamond the size of a peppercorn, set not in a band but in the base of his thumbnail, under a translucent coat of something that might be resin, and yet he does not drip with wealth in the vulgar way of merchants. These are not displays for admiration. They are interruptions, like punctuation marks in unexpected places. Historians agree that he owned one of the largest personal collections of gems in the region. Sapphires from Sri Lanka, emeralds from Colombia, spinels from Badakhshan, but what he did with them remains the subject of speculation. One chronicler writes of a banquet where guests discovered rubies sewn into the seams of the tablecloths, invisible until they ran their fingers along the stitching. Another insists the king once gave an emerald to a poet, instructing him to hide it in a book so no one would think to steal it. But the most persistent and most contested story is this, that some of the jewels were not for display at all, but for touch, that he wore them in hidden places beneath his sleeves, under his collar, even sewn into the lining of his gloves, so he could run his fingers over them in private moments, as if the smoothness of the stone itself was a form of thought. Tonight, you see a different kind of arrangement. He arrives in a robe the color of storm clouds, the fabric so heavy it seems to drag at his shoulders. But the weight, you realize, isn't from the cloth, it's from what's inside it. Tiny beads of lapis, dozens of them, stitched along the inner hems so they are never visible, only felt. When he walks, they knock softly against each other, a sound no one else seems to notice, but that you can't unhear. He stops in front of you, holding out a goblet. You take it, and as your fingers brush his, you feel it, something sharp pressing against the inside of his cuff. For a second, you think it's a blade, but when the fabric shifts, you catch a glint, a sliver of amethyst, polished to a point, but not cut for beauty. A secret shard of purple, hidden against his wrist. Why? That is the question that sticks in your throat. An Italian ambassador once claimed in a letter, half destroyed by water damage, that the king placed certain gems in specific positions on his body as a form of astral alignment, believing the stones could influence his health, his thoughts, even his dreams. The ambassador's peers dismissed it as superstition, but the rumor persists in the corners of the archives. There's another explanation, whispered among the servants. The jewels are maps, not literal, not to a place you can walk to, but to something the king alone understands. The placement is deliberate. This sapphire means loyalty. That garnet means passion. The emerald at the base of his throat means victory. Worn together, they are a language without words. You see proof of this language in the smallest gestures. At the banquet table, he taps the emerald on his wrist twice before answering a question about military movements. When a courtier tells a joke that skirts the edge of disrespect, the king brushes his fingers against the garnet on his sleeve before laughing. To you, the motions look casual, but to someone who knows the code, perhaps they are sentences. And then there are the truly strange adornments, the ones that make even seasoned historians blink. One traveler's account, half memoir, half fever dream, describes seeing the king wearing a single pearl in the hollow of his throat, affixed not by chain or glue but by a mysterious means that gave the impression the pearl had grown there like a second Adam's apple. The traveler, unfortunately, was known for exaggeration, and so the claim has never been proven. But when you see the faint pale circle on the king's skin tonight, you wonder. He sits beside you now, close enough that the heat from his body seeps through your sleeve. He reaches for a platter of figs, and you catch a glimpse of something astonishing, a sliver of ruby pressed into the edge of his index finger, so small and so perfectly set that it looks like a drop of blood caught forever under the skin. You want to ask him about it, about all of it, but the words feel too direct, too heavy. Instead, you say, "You must have the best jeweler in the world." He smiles without looking at you. The best understands that some jewels are not meant to be seen, and that is the end of it. Later, after the room has emptied and the echoes of music fade into the corridors, you catch sight of him again, this time in the shadowed garden. The moonlight catches something on his ankle, a chain of tiny opals, so pale they are nearly invisible against his skin. He pauses at the edge of the fountain, slips off his sandal, and steps into the water without hesitation. The opals vanish beneath the ripples. When he walks away, you are left wondering if you imagined the whole thing. The royal bath ritual you have seen bathing before. Buckets poured over backs, steam curling from shallow basins. But nothing like this. Here, bathing is not cleansing. It is theater. The chamber is already hot when you arrive. Not warm, not pleasant, but oppressive. The kind of heat that makes you aware of your own skin. Two great braziers burn at either end of the room, feeding the air with the smell of sandalwood and something darker, almost medicinal. The floor is marble, but not the pale, clean marble of temples. This is veined red and gold, as if the stone itself has been steeped in spices. In the center lies the pool, not a perfect circle or a neat rectangle, but an irregular shape that twists like a river bend. The water inside is cloudy, not with dirt, but with milk and crushed petals. Roses, mostly, though you catch flashes of violet and saffron drifting lazily on the surface. The king stands at the far edge, wearing nothing but a robe of thin linen that clings to him in the heat. 4 attendants move around him, each carrying something, a jug, a bundle of cloth, a small casket. They are silent, except for the soft slap of bare feet on stone. One kneels and unfastens the robe. The linen slides away, revealing a body marked not just by age and power, but by the strange geography you've come to expect from him. Faint lines from old jewels pressed into the skin. Pale circles where stones have been removed. The attendants do not guide him into the pool. He guides them. He steps into the water slowly, letting it rise around his calves, his knees, his thighs. The milk clings to him in ghostly streaks. When he finally lowers himself to sit on the submerged stone ledge, the petals gather around his torso like a coronation. One of the attendants, a boy no older than 16, begins to pour water over the king's head. Not in great splashes, but in a slow, constant stream, as if timing matters. The water runs down his face, his beard dripping into the pool. It is then that you notice the jugs are not identical. Each one has a different scent, first rose water, then something sharp and citrus-like, then a deep, resinous smell that makes your tongue feel heavy. The sequence is deliberate, a kind of olfactory layering, as if the king is building a scent in the same way a painter builds color. Historians agree that perfumed bathing was common among royalty in the late medieval courts, a display of wealth, health, and refinement. But the chronicler of this king's court hints at something stranger. He describes the bath as a preparation of the body for unseen conversation, a phrase that scholars still argue about. Some think it refers to diplomacy, others to religion, and a few, the ones with the strangest theories, suggest the king believed the scents could summon or repel spirits. You lean closer to the edge of the pool, watching as the attendants begin the second phase. They take cloths dipped in warm oil and press them to his skin, not rubbing, not scrubbing, just holding them there until the oil soaks in. The smell is heavy now, almond, myrrh, and something faintly metallic. The king closes his eyes, his breathing deepens, slows, becomes almost ceremonial, and then, in the stillness, you hear it, a low hum, not from the attendants. Their mouths are closed. It's coming from him, a single note, vibrating in his chest, rippling the surface of the milky water. The attendants respond by moving in a new pattern, circling him clockwise, pouring and pressing, pouring and pressing. One court gossip once claimed that during these rituals, the king spoke in a language no one could identify, not Latin, not Greek, not Arabic, but something older, or perhaps invented. Official records never confirm it, but you see his lips move now, and the words are not ones you know. The final stage is the strangest. From the small casket, one attendant withdraws a chain of gold beads. You think at first it's jewelry, but as they lower it into the water, the surface begins to fizz. The beads are dissolving, releasing tiny bubbles and a sharp, metallic scent. The king dips his hands into the cloud of bubbles and rubs them together slowly, almost reverently, before letting the foam wash away. When it is done, he stands. The milk and petals run from his body in rivulets, pooling at his feet before being swept into hidden drains. An attendant brings a cloak of deep blue velvet, dry, impossibly dry in this steam, and wraps it around him. The whole ritual has taken nearly an hour. Yet no one speaks of it afterward. It is not discussed at table, not written about in detail, not even whispered among the servants in your hearing, as though what you saw is something you are expected to forget, and yet you know you won. Because just before he left the chamber, the king caught your gaze. Not for long, not enough to draw attention, but long enough that you felt the heat of the water all over again, and you thought, though you cannot be sure, that the scent clinging to him was not rose or almond or myrrh, but something like iron, sharp and living, the smell of blood washed clean. birds, beasts, and bedroom guests, you expect a royal bedchamber to be guarded, private, and silent. This one is none of those things. The sound hits you before the sight does, a layered, unpredictable chorus, the deep chuff of a large animal, the rapid clicking of claws on stone, the flutter of wings against fabric, and above it all, the clear, imperious cry of a bird that has never known fear. When the heavy oak doors open, the smell rushes out, not the perfume-soaked air of earlier rooms, but something raw, warm, hay-oiled leather, and the faint metallic temps of fresh meat. The king's bed is there. Of course, a massive thing draped in embroidered silk, its posts carved into twisting vines and lions, mid-leap. But the bed is not the centerpiece here. No, your eyes go first to the tall perches, scattered around the room, each one holding a bird with feathers so brilliant they look painted. Falcons, mostly, though one larger than the rest, is unmistakably an eagle. Their heads turn in perfect unison to watch you enter, eyes bright and unblinking. On the far side of the room lies a creature that could make lesser courtiers faint, a cheetah, stretched out like an oversized house cat, its tail flicking lazily, its eyes half-lidded, but tracking every movement. A length of golden chain is attached to its collar, more for show than restraint. This is not a hunting lodge. This is the king's personal sleeping quarters. It is known, recorded, in fact, by both foreign envoys and his own scribes, that the king kept animals close. Not in separate menageries, as was custom, but in the same rooms he lived and slept. And the official explanation was symbolic. The falcons represented keen sight and swift justice. The cheetah, royal speed and precision in war. But then there are the stranger accounts, the ones that whisper of nights when the king insisted. The animals remained beside him as he entertained guests of a more personal nature. You see the evidence now. The bed is set far from the hearth, leaving the warmest space for the animals. A small marble basin in the corner holds fresh water, not for washing, but for the creatures. A silver tray of raw meat sits just inside the balcony doors, guarded by a servant who looks more like a falconer than a chamber attendant. The king himself is seated near the balcony, a hawk perched on his gloved hand. He strokes its breast feathers with the kind of tenderness usually reserved for lovers. When the bird clicks its beak, he smiles faintly, as if it has just whispered a joke only the two of them understand. Historians still argue about the purpose of this arrangement. Some say it was a display of dominance, proof that he could tame both wild beasts and human guests with equal ease. Others suspect a more superstitious angle, that he believed the animals could sense lies, detect disloyalty, or ward off illness. A few more daring scholars suggest the king simply enjoyed the sensation of living in a private world where humans and animals were equals, or rivals. The cheetah stirs as you move closer. Its eyes sharpen, its ears twitch. The king notices, and gestures for you to stop. He doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't need to. The animal relaxes instantly, as though lulled by some unspoken command. And then the king speaks not to you, but to the bird on his arm. He addresses it by name, a long, poetic string of syllables, and then, impossibly, he pauses, tilts his head, and listens as if expecting an answer. When the bird cries out, sharp and short, he nods, satisfied. One chronicler claims that the king chose his bedmates, human bedmates, based on his animals' reactions. If the falcons turned away, the guest was dismissed. If the cheetah curled at their feet, they were welcomed. Whether this is truth, or just the court's favorite rumor, you cannot tell. But as you stand here, surrounded by watchful eyes, both feathered and furred, you feel the weight of being assessed, measured, judged. The balcony doors are open, letting in a rush of cool air. From somewhere beyond the walls comes the sound of another bird, free, wild. The hawk on the king's arm responds, wings half spreading, a ripple of muscle under feathers. The king strokes its neck once more, then releases it into the open night. It takes off in a flash of gold and shadow, gone in seconds. The cheetah yawns, showing teeth like polished ivory, then settles back into its long, languid coil. The king finally looks at you, and you realize you've been holding your breath. This is his domain, not just the palace, not just the throne room, but this strange, wild intersection of human luxury and animal instinct. And here, in this room, you are not entirely sure which one he thinks you are. The endless pillow talk. The room is dim now. Not dark. The king does not like darkness, but lit in a way that erases corners and makes everything seem closer than it is. Oil lamps hang from chains above the bed, swaying faintly as if stirred by a breath you can't quite feel. The air is heavy, not with incense this time, but with the quiet weight of late hours. You have been here longer than you realized. The palace's clocks, massive things that toll each hour with the authority of cannon fire, have struck midnight, then 1, then 2. Yet here you remain, propped against cushions embroidered so finely that the threads catch on your fingertips. The king is beside you, though beside is not quite right. He is both next to you and around you, leaning in, his voice low, his gaze fixed in a way that makes it impossible to glance away without feeling you've broken some unspoken rule. This is not flirtation, or at least, not only flirtation. This is something else, an endless, winding conversation that never allows you to leave. He speaks of everything and nothing. He tells you the story of a storm he once saw at sea, the waves taller than the palace walls, the sky so black it seemed to swallow light. Before you can respond, he asks if you have ever noticed how gold changes color in candlelight. And before you can answer that, he is recounting the lineage of a horse he once rode into battle. Each topic threads into the next without pause. His words wrap around you like the silks covering the bed, soft but unyielding. And you begin to understand why courtiers call this the net. Once you are caught in it, you do not escape until he decides you can. It's said, recorded in more than one ambassador's letter, that the king could speak without stopping for half a day. Not in speeches, but in this drifting, hypnotic way that made you lose your sense of time. It was a weapon, in its own strange fashion. Envoys who entered at dusk to discuss treaties sometimes emerged at dawn, having agreed to terms they barely remembered negotiating. But here, in the bedroom, the effect is different. There are no scribes, no witnesses, just you, the bed, the lamps, and his voice. He asks about your childhood, not idly, but with a precision that makes you realize he's drawing a map of you, where you were born, what you feared, what made you laugh when you were 12. And as you answer, you find yourself telling him things you have not told anyone. The words slip out easily in the warm, lamplit haze. Sometimes he laughs. Not loudly, his laughter is low, almost private, as if he doesn't want anyone but you to hear it. Sometimes he falls silent, eyes distant, as though he's following some invisible path only he can see. Those silences never last long. He always returns with another question, another fragment of story, another thread to pull. Historians disagree on what these pillow talks meant. Some think they were simply the king's way of enjoying company without the risk of physical scandal. Others believe they were intelligence-gathering sessions, the bed serving as both couch and interrogation chair. The most suspicious claim that the king used these conversations to bind people to him in ways loyalty oaths never could, that once you'd spoken your secrets into the warmth of his bed, you belonged to him. You start to notice a pattern. Every time you grow comfortable, lulled by the rhythm of his voice, he drops something sharp into the flow. A remark about betrayal, a question about your loyalties, a sudden memory of someone who used to sit where you are now and no longer visits. The effect is like stepping into warm water and finding a cold current at your feet. He never asks you to stay, but neither does he dismiss you. Hours pass. The lamps burn low. Your eyes grow heavy, but sleep never quite comes. The conversation is too alive, too constant. And then, without warning, he stops speaking. The silence is complete. Even the soft hiss of the lamps seems to fade. You realize you have been leaning toward him, as if drawn by some invisible thread. And now that the thread is cut, you feel its absence like a sudden drop in air pressure. He looks at you for a long moment, then smiles. Not kindly, but knowingly. "We will continue," he says, as if you have agreed to something, as if this is only the beginning, and you understand, with a slow, sinking certainty, that you will think about this night for years, not because of what happened, but because of everything that didn't. You arrive expecting an audience. What you get is a desk. Not a ceremonial desk. Not the kind draped in brocade and gold leaf that is rolled out when foreign envoys come to negotiate treaties, but a real desk. A working desk. And the king is at it, quill in hand. Hunched forward with the posture of a man who has not moved in hours. Around him, the air smells faintly of beeswax, paper dust, and the metallic temps of ink. The candles are stubby from overuse, their wax pooling in slow, exhausted rivulets. This is not a staged moment. You've walked in on something raw, unpolished, almost private. You think perhaps you should leave, but then the king looks up. "Come," he says, beckoning with the tip of the quill as if it were a scepter. "You will witness history." He doesn't mean treaties. He doesn't mean decrees. He means letters, personal letters, handwritten, each one sealed with wax stamped by his signet ring. On the desk are stacks of them, tied in silk ribbons, crimson, gold, and a peculiar shade of blue you've never seen before. They are not all addressed to the same person. In fact, they are not even addressed to the same kind of person. One is to a duchess, another to a palace gardener, another to the captain of the guard. One bears no name at all, only the words, to whoever finds this first. You watch as the king finishes a sentence with a flourish, sands it dry, and begins folding the paper with an almost loving precision. He does not pause to think, as if the words are simply pouring through him. You see, he says, sealing the wax with a firm press. The trouble with affection is that people expect you to ration it. He reaches for another sheet. I do not ration. I give freely, to everyone. Why should I be miserly with the only thing that multiplies when it is spent? The letters are not all the same. Some are intimate lines that could make a person blush if read aloud. Others are jokes, clever and wicked, the kind that could topple reputations if they fell into the wrong hands. Some are political, cloaked in endearments that make their real meaning slippery. A few are simply nonsense rhymes about the taste of apricots, descriptions of clouds that look like horses. One letter to a foreign queen contains a single sentence. If the wind changes, you will know why I cannot look at the sea the same way again. No date, no signature. Just the royal seal. This is the king's art. His seduction is not always of the body. Often it is of the mind, the heart, the curiosity. To receive a letter from him, even a single line, is to feel chosen, and yet to learn that others have received their own letters is to feel betrayed, and this is where the trouble begins. It is recorded in the private diary of an ambassador's wife, whose handwriting tilts sharply, as if she were writing in a hurry, that there was once a single afternoon when 3 recipients of the king's letters confronted him in the same corridor. One carried her letter folded and unfolded so many times. The edges had frayed. She wanted to know if the line about the golden horizon was meant for her alone. Another had brought 2 letters, one from last year and one from last week, and pointed out that they both contained the exact phrase, "The night will carry us if we let it." The third was silent, merely holding her letter like a blade. The king listened, smiled, said nothing. By nightfall, he had sent each of them a new letter, each one containing an apology, so sincere it made the recipient feel foolish for ever doubting him. Yet when the 3 compared their new letters weeks later, they found they were identical. Historians still argue over whether the king's letter writing was strategy or compulsion. One camp insists it was deliberate, that he used letters as a way of binding people to him in a web of emotion, obligation, and intrigue. A letter, after all, could be denied. It could be reinterpreted. It could be lost at the perfect moment, to be found by precisely the wrong person. The other camp claims it was simply his nature, an uncontrollable urge to express, to connect, to scatter pieces of himself like seeds, never knowing which might take root. The truth may be somewhere in between. There is one letter, however, that remains at the center of the greatest palace mystery. It was addressed only to my moonlight. No name, no date, no return seal, just the royal mark on dark blue wax. The contents have never been made public, but whatever it said, it was dangerous enough that when it fell into the wrong hands, the king ordered the destruction of every letter he had written in the preceding year. This was a logistical nightmare. Messengers were intercepted. Private chambers were searched. Whole chests of correspondence were burned in the palace courtyards under the cover of night. Yet even so, whispers claimed that not all were destroyed, that some letters survived, tucked inside other books, hidden beneath false drawer bottoms, carried far from the capital by those who knew their worth. And to this day, archivists hunting through old estates still sometimes find a sheet of royal stationery, folded twice and sealed in wax, its words faded but legible. You stand by the desk as the king continues. He writes a line, looks up at you, and says, "This one is for you." He slides the sheet across before the ink has dried. Your name is there at the top, though perhaps that could be added later to any letter. The words beneath are ambiguous. They could be romantic. They could be political. They could be nothing at all. Toddy does not explain. Keep it, he's... The festival of excess. You don't notice the festival at first. You feel it. The palace walls tremble faintly, as if the stone itself is trying not to breathe too loudly under the strain of what's happening inside. A thud, a cheer, a ripple of music so dense it doesn't quite sound like music anymore. More like the pulse of something alive. You follow the sound. The corridors are already littered with abandoned shoes, half-emptied goblets, and garlands drooping like they've given up on pretending to be festive. A page runs past you barefoot, clutching a roasted pheasant in one hand and a gold mask in the other. You smell oranges, cinnamon, hot wax, and a faint note of something you can't place. Perhaps perfume, perhaps smoke. Then you reach the double doors to the grand hall, and everything hits you at once. The hall has been transformed. Gone is the cold marble austerity. Tonight, it's a jungle. Silk banners drape from the ceiling like vines, catching candlelight in shades of crimson, emerald, and gold. The air is thick, not unpleasantly, but oppressively, with incense that seems designed less to please than to intoxicate. At the center, the king sits not on his throne, but on a massive divan piled with cushions. His robes are undone at the neck. His hair is threaded with tiny golden leaves that catch the light when he turns his head. Around him, people move in a way that's halfway between dancing and stumbling. Minstrels play melodies that keep changing, rhythm mid-song, forcing the dancers into unpredictable sways and spins. The laughter is too loud, too constant, as though no one dares stop. Here's the thing. This isn't an annual event. It's not tied to a coronation, a treaty, or a religious holiday. This is the holiday. The festival of excess exists for no reason other than the king's desire to push human indulgence to its furthest limits, historically speaking, and this is the one grounded fact. Court chroniclers all agree on the festival once lasted 42 hours without pause. Guests collapsed in corners to nap, woke to eat again, danced until they couldn't feel their feet, and returned to the feast as if nothing had happened. The kitchen fires were kept burning so hot that pigeons roosting in the palace rafters dropped, dead from the heat. Wine casks were rolled directly into the hall and tapped where they stood. Musicians were replaced in shifts so the music never faltered. And then there's the detail that sounds too absurd to be true, but multiple accounts swear it happened. On the second night of one festival, the king ordered an indoor rainstorm. Buckets of rosewater were hoisted to the upper balconies, and servants poured them slowly through sieves so that a fine mist descended on the dancers. It wasn't enough to drench anyone, just enough to bead on skin, to make the silks cling in ways that left nothing to imagination. Rose petals, already damp, stuck to people's hair and shoulders. The floor became slick, forcing everyone into slower, more intimate movements. The scent of crushed petals mixed with sweat and incense until it was impossible to tell where one ended and another began. Some historians insist the festival of excess was political theater. By showing such abundance, such waste, the king projected an image of power so vast that it could afford to be careless. No famine, no rebellion could touch a ruler who could rain rosewater indoors simply because he wanted to. Others claim it was self-destruction in disguise, that each festival was a test to see how far his body, his court, and his treasury could be pushed before something snapped. The truth is, no one knows. You weave through the crowd. The tables are sagging under platters of roasted game, towers of candied fruit, and pies whose crusts have been shaped into the likeness of animals. A woman in a gown the color of midnight offers you a fig. When you bite into it, honey spills down your chin. She laughs, catches it with her fingertip, and vanishes into the crush of dancers before you can speak. Someone is playing a game at the far end. of the hall, blindfolded guests trying to guess the flavor of wine by scent alone. Nearby, two courtiers are locked in a mock sword fight, using roasted legs of lamb. No one stops them. In one corner, a group sits cross-legged on the floor, passing around a golden bowl filled with pomegranate seeds steeped in something stronger than wine. Their laughter is slower, deeper, as if they are hearing a different rhythm from everyone else. Then you notice the king watching you. He doesn't move, just observes, the kind of gaze that makes you feel as though you're already part of a plan you haven't yet agreed to. You realize he hasn't been dancing, hasn't been eating much. He's been watching, and maybe that's the real point of the festival. Not to join in, but to create a living tapestry of human indulgence. The first thing you notice is how quiet the corridor is. Too quiet for the part of the palace you're in. You've walked these halls before, during the day, when the sound of servants hurrying past, pages chattering, and ministers arguing filled the air. But tonight, there's nothing but the muffled creak of your own steps against the carpet. The lamps here are dimmer, not unlit, just enough to leave shadows hanging at the edges, long enough to hide a figure who doesn't want to be seen. You reach the door. No guards, no heralds, just an intricate bronze handle shaped like two intertwined serpents. You hesitate before touching it. You've heard the stories. Everyone has dot inside. The room isn't grand, not like the throne room, not like the banquet hall. The ceiling is low, the walls thick with tapestries that make the air feel warmer than it should. A fire burns in the hearth, but it's not the main source of heat that comes from the women. They sit in a loose circle on cushions, their silks pooling like liquid color on the floor. They're not courtiers, not in the formal, political sense, but they know more state secrets than half the king's ministers. The courtesans of this court aren't merely companions. They are confidants, spies, negotiators, and sometimes executioners. And at the center of them all sits the king. He's not in robes, not wearing the crown. Instead, he's dressed in a simple tunic, the fabric so fine it catches the firelight like water. His hair's loose, a strand falling across his cheek as he leans forward to speak to the woman nearest him. You can't hear what he says, only the reaction it causes. A ripple of laughter that isn't girlish or polite, but sharp, knowing, like the crack of a whip. The courtesan's eyes shift to you as one. Not with hostility, but with the kind of assessment that makes you want to straighten your posture. They weigh you in seconds, decide whether you belong here, and, apparently, decide you do, or at least, that you're no threat. Here's the first grounded fact historians agree on. Many of the king's most controversial decrees were first spoken aloud in rooms like this, long before the council chamber heard them. Witnesses, those rare few who later dared speak, claimed treaties were drafted between sips of spiced wine, assassinations planned while someone was being fed pomegranate seeds by hand. The courtesans were not distractions from politics. They were politics. A servant appears with a tray wine in crystal goblets, each cup a different shape and size, as if the set was collected over years from every corner of the known world. You take one without being offered, and no one stops you. The wine is heavy, sweet, with an aftertaste that prickles the back of your throat. The woman to your right leans close enough that you can smell her. Jasmine, and something darker, muskier. First time, she asks. You nod. Her smile is slow. Then watch your words. Here, the truth has a price, but lies cost more. Now, here's a detail that sounds almost too strange to be real, but enough. Whispered accounts survive to make it believable. The king once used his courtesans as living messages. He would send one dressed in a particular color, with a particular scent and piece of jewelry to appear at a foreign envoy's private quarters. No words exchanged, no letter handed over. The envoy would see her, note the details, and know the king's exact answer to a political question asked days earlier. An emerald bracelet meant agreement. A hairpin shaped like a swallow meant refusal. A sprig of rosemary in her hair meant, war. The firelight flickers. One of the courtesans, a woman in crimson with a scar tracing her jawline, begins to sing softly. The melody is ancient, the language older still. The others listen without speaking, and even the king's expression changes, not softened, exactly, but sharpened, as though the song reminds him of something he'd almost forgotten. You realize you're seeing something you're not meant to. The crown, here, is invisible, but its weight is everywhere. It presses down on every movement, every laugh, every shared glance. This isn't a place where the king escapes his duties. This is where he rewrites them. Some historians insist the courtesans wielded more influence than the official council, that laws were born not from debate in the throne room, but from whispers over silk pillows. Others argue that this is romantic nonsense, that men simply cannot stand the idea that women in such a position might have had real power. The truth, you suspect it's both. The king finally turns to you. Do you know why they call this the inner court? He asks. You shake your head. Because the outer court is where I pretend to rule, he says. Here is where I decide to. The courtesans laugh again, not at him, but with him, as though the statement is both a private joke and an absolute truth. You sip your wine, and the heat from the fire feels suddenly heavier. The night stretches ahead. You're no longer sure if you're a guest here, or a pawn. The jewelry of affectionate begins with a box, not the kind you see in goldsmiths' windows, not lacquered or encrusted with gems to advertise its worth. This one is plain, wooden, its surface worn smooth by hands that carried it too often, too far. You've seen enough court finery to know that when something looks this unassuming, it's because what's inside is anything but. When you open it, there's only one piece, a necklace, but it's unlike anything you've seen in the royal treasury. The chain is rough, almost crude, made of interlinked iron, but at its center is a single stone, a deep green, uncut, jagged, as if it had been plucked from the earth moments before being set. The king gave this to a woman he loved, and by the time she wore it, everyone in the palace knew exactly what it meant. See? His gifts of affection were not the predictable offerings of other monarchs. You will not find diamond tiaras or pearl combs in the stories told about him, unless the diamonds were carved into impossible shapes, or the pearls were blackened in fire before being set in rings. Where another ruler might send roses, he sent obsidian. Where another might offer a gold bracelet, he sent a shard of meteorite, wrapped in silver wire so fine it could cut skin. Here's the first grounded historical fact. The king once presented an ambassador's wife with a pendant made from the vertebra of a bird that existed nowhere in the known world. The court naturalist claimed it was from a species lost to time. The palace gossip claimed it had been stolen from the private collection of a rival emperor. Either way, the message was clear. You are rare, and I want the world to know I own something no one else can. But the gifts weren't simply strange, for the sake of strangeness. Each had a meaning. A ruby with a flaw in the shape of a teardrop meant I forgive you. An unpolished opal meant I still doubt you. A gold chain with a broken link left unrepaired meant I am not finished with you. Some claimed the king kept a ledger, hidden somewhere in the palace, cataloging each piece he had given and the exact emotion it was meant to convey. A secret dictionary of desire and disappointment. And then there's the unbelievable but possibly true account. One winter, he is said to have commissioned a set of earrings carved from ice. Yes, ice. The jeweler froze water from the first snow of the year, shaping it around a delicate frame of crystal so thin it was invisible. The earrings lasted only as long as the wearer stayed in the king's company, melting away into nothing if she dared leave. Historians still argue whether such a thing could have been made, but the symbolism is almost too perfect not to be real. Tonight, you find yourself in the royal workshop, though workshop feels like the wrong word for this place. There are no artisans bustling about, no sounds of hammering metal or cutting stone, just the king himself, seated at a long table under the dim glow of oil lamps, a scattering of raw gems before him. He doesn't look up when you enter. Instead, he turns a piece of amber over in his fingers, holding it to the light to see the insect trapped inside. Do you know, he says without greeting, why I never give anyone a diamond as it is? You shake your head, because a diamond doesn't remember where it came from. It's too perfect, too eager to pretend it was always beautiful. I prefer stones that show their history, cracks, stains, flaws. He sets the amber down. People are the same? That's when you notice the cabinet in the corner, dozens of small drawers, each labeled not with the name of the jewel it contains, but with a single word: loyalty, regret, hunger, revenge. You pull one open at random. Inside is a small brooch shaped like a crescent moon, carved from mother of the word on the drawer: patience. Don't touch that, the king says, almost lazily. It hasn't been given yet. The courtiers whispered that these tokens could make or break a person standing overnight. To receive one was to be marked, not just as the object of the king's affection, but as someone now under the scrutiny, jealousy, and silent threat of every other person in the palace. There are stories of women too frightened to wear the gifts in public, hiding them in locked chests. Others wore them boldly, almost daring someone to take offense. A few, a very few, returned them. One of the most debated events in court history happened during the Feast of Lanterns, before a hall packed with nobles. The king placed a narrow, gold circlet, not a crown, but something closer to a choker, around the neck of a court musician. The musician was not of noble birth, nor in any political alliance. But the jewel at its center, a star sapphire that caught every flicker of candlelight, made her instantly the most talked about person in the kingdom. By dawn, she was gone. Some said she'd fled, afraid of what the gift meant. Others swore she'd been taken away under guard. The choker was never seen again. The historians still argue, was it love, lust, or a message meant for someone else entirely? The king never said back in the workshop. He picks up a thin strip of gold, bending it gently into a curve. He works with the ease of someone who has done this 100 times before, and you realize he is not just commissioning these pieces, he is making them. You glance again at the drawers, at the rows of unlabeled boxes stacked along the far wall. Each one could hold a scandal, or a promise, or a curse. How do you decide? You ask. Who gets what? The king smiles, but it's not a warm expression. I don't decide. They do. They just don't know it yet. Later, when you leave the room, you feel heavier, though you carry nothing with you. Somewhere in the palace, someone is wearing a piece of the king's affection tonight, and whether it will make them or destroy them is something no jewel can tell. He game of disguise you do not recognize the king at first. That is the point. He passes you in the dimly lit bazaar with the posture of a man who has spent his life negotiating for bread instead of empires. His cloak is patched at the elbow. The hem is muddy. There is a faint smell of horses, stale wine, and dust on him. The hood shadows his face, and you think, just another tired traveler. Only later, when you hear the whispers in the tavern do, you realize who it was. For the king, slipping into the skin of an ordinary man is not an escape, it is a weapon. A dangerous hobby. Historians like to romanticize it, calling it a quirk or eccentricity, but they forget the risks. In a kingdom where a single insult to the wrong stranger could cost you your head. Walking the streets without guards was the kind of madness only a man drunk on power, or the thrill of danger would attempt. Officially, it was said he did it to understand his people, to feel the pulse of the market, to know what bread cost and whether the bakers were honest. But that was the polite version for the court scribes. In reality, the disguises had more varied purposes. The wardrobe beneath the throne, in a hidden chamber behind the royal dressing hall, stood a rack of clothes so mismatched it looked like a thief's ransom. A dockworker's coarse tunic, frayed at the collar, a silk merchant's robe, stained with pomegranate juice, a stable boy's leather jerkin, still carrying the smell of hay and sweat, a fortune teller's layered skirts, complete with a jingling belt of coins. Beside them, an assortment of wigs, false beards, scarves, and battered boots, and masks, not ornate ball masks for court masquerades, but crude, chipped masks worn by beggars at winter festivals. One historian claimed to have seen a notebook where the king kept sketches of every disguise, each page labeled with an alias: Hasim the card player, Tahir the candle seller, Rafiq the wandering poet. Whether the notebook ever truly existed remains debated. Some think it was burned after his death. Others think it sits in a private collection, bought for a fortune by a collector who enjoys secrets more than art. First time he went out in disguise, it was almost by accident. A festival night, the city loud with drums and drunken laughter. He borrowed a tattered cloak from a servant, pulled it over his brocade jacket, and wandered out alone. The thrill was immediate. No one bowed. No one stiffened at his approach. A wine seller shouted at him for blocking the stall. A child splashed muddy water on his boots without fear of punishment. The anonymity was intoxicating. That night, he bought roasted chestnuts from a street cart, played dice with sailors, and listened to two old women argue about the palace taxes. By dawn, he had decided this would not be the last time. The nights out over the years, the disguises grew bolder. Some nights he posed as a merchant, slipping into taverns to overhear gossip about the court. Other nights, he dressed as a beggar, crouched in shadowed alleys, and listened to the stories people told when they thought no one important was listening. And sometimes, more dangerously, he used the disguises to meet people he had no business meeting. Lovers who could never set foot in the palace. Poets whose verses mocked the throne. Merchants whose deals skirted the edge of treason. One infamous outing involved him pretending to be a visiting lute player from a far-off province. Under that guise, he performed in a tavern, for coin his voice untrained, but charming enough to win applause. A merchant's daughter invited him to her family table. The night ended with him slipping away just before her father returned. A scandal, barely avoided. The rumor of the dock incident, there is one story, half rumor, half truth, that scholars still argue over. They say he once disguised himself as a dockhand to watch the unloading of a shipment of rare spices. These spices, however, were not meant for public sale. They were part of a royal monopoly. By mingling with the laborers, he discovered that a high-ranking official had been skimming the goods and selling them privately. The king supposedly confronted the man, not in court, but in a darkened alley, still wearing the dockhand's clothes, speaking in a voice low and dangerous. Whether this confrontation truly happened, or is just the invention of later storytellers, no one knows. The official did disappear from records shortly after, replaced without explanation. A dangerous addiction as years passed. The outings became riskier. He began traveling further from the palace, sometimes alone, sometimes with one trusted guard also in disguise. There were close calls. Once, a group of drunk soldiers tried to rob him, thinking him an easy target. Another time, a shopkeeper accused him of shortchanging her, shouting loud enough to draw a crowd. He diffused the situation with a grin and an extra coin, but he later admitted to a confidant that he'd never felt his heart pound so hard. Some of the court hated these habits. Ministers warned that if you were recognized in the wrong place, at the wrong time, the entire kingdom could be thrown into chaos. But the king only smiled and replied, If they cannot find their king in the streets, they will never find him in the palace. The Woman in the Red Veil, one of the most whispered about episodes, took place during the rainy season. The king, dressed as a scholar, fallen on hard times, took shelter under an awning. Beside him stood a woman with a red silk veil, her perfume cutting through the damp air. They spoke briefly, her words, polite but edged with wheat and parted without names. A week later, the king ordered a search for a woman matching her description. Some claim she became his mistress. Others insist she was a spy from a neighboring court. The truth is lost, buried under contradictory accounts. But one thing is certain. After that night, he was seen more often in the scholar's disguise, as if hoping to cross paths with her again. The Mask Within the Manon, the end. The disguises were not just about hiding, they were about revealing. In court, the king had to be the king, every gesture calculated, every word weighed. But in the streets, behind a false beard or under a ragged hood, he could be cruel, kind, reckless, or flirtatious without consequence. The disguises gave him freedom, but they also fed his hunger for control. Knowing the city's secrets made him a more dangerous ruler. Knowing how people truly spoke of him made his decisions sharper, sometimes crueler. The final disguise, the last time he wore a disguise, was also the closest he came to disaster. Disguised as a traitor, he was caught in a tavern brawl. A knife flashed, a table overturned. In the chaos, his hood slipped, and someone recognized him not from his face, but from the heavy ring he always forgot to remove. He escaped only because the man who recognized him happened to be loyal. But after that night, the disguises ended. The risk was no longer thrilling, it was too close to ruin. Still, the memory lingered, and those who had once met him on the streets in another skin would sometimes smile quietly. Remembering the night, they drank with a stranger who could have them executed before breakfast. And maybe, just maybe, they still wondered how much of that stranger was the real man, and how much was the mask.